Presentation is about trans-war and popular music from 1926 to 1959. We have to start by defining the word trans-war, which refers to the period before, during, and after World War II. This gives us a historical view that includes World War II, but also includes the periods just before and after, and therefore gives us a continuous idea of history in motion. We want to start with the foundation of JOAK, what is today NHK radio, in 1925. You required a license to be able to listen to JOAK in Japan in 1925. By 1926, JOAK was national in Japan, and by the end of the decade, JOAK was also broadcasting in Korea with both a Japanese broadcast stream and a Korean language broadcast stream. World War II was a brutal exercise that involved in Asia Japanese occupation of China, continued occupation and extended brutality in Korea, occupation of Manchuria, occupation of Southeast Asia, continued occupation of Taiwan. The brutality was tremendous. The use of civilians in China as experimental subjects for Unit 731, which experimented on them using biological weapons. There were many more atrocities that were committed by Japan in the course of World War II. Japanese civilians were also heavily depended upon by the government and really unable to make choices themselves about what political situation they preferred. Japan, instead, encountered what we might call war fever. Many currents were flowing together to produce this sea change of attitudes in the early 1930s, whereas Japan had been a relatively democratic state in the 1920s. By the early 1930s, the military was considered necessary to contain the rise of Chinese nationalism. Not much was talked about Japanese nationalism within Japan. Japan also felt a sense of international isolation after it withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933, when the League of Nations considered it to be at fault in the invasion of Manchuria in 1932. Japan was also taking part in imperialist competition with Western nations, which became quite intense during the 1930s. And as I said, at the end of the 1920s, we see the end of what was known in Japan as Taisho democracy, which was a democratic or roughly democratic form of government in Japan. And part of what ended that was a perceived need by the military to build up its strength in response to international pressures. To do this, the military and the Japanese government also engaged in militarization of popular culture and the proliferation of social organizations for total war. These points come from Louise Young's Japan's Total Empire on page 55. Part of the militarization of Japan's civilian sector included NHK, which we saw at the beginning of this presentation, which became an imperial broadcasting network, essentially broadcasting Japan's point of view, the Japanese nationalist point of view, and propaganda in favor of Japanese nationalism and imperialism. For example, in Korea, while there were Japanese and Korean language streams, all of the music, all of the news, all of the broadcast was controlled directly from Japan. On the right, you see a photograph of a scene from a famous movie called Shina no Yoru, or China Nights, which was a propaganda film starring this woman, Lee Shanglan, who is also a Japanese woman who grew up in China. She was one of the 7 great singers of Chinese pop culture fame, but she was actually Japanese. Her name was Yamaguchi Yoshiko, and she starred in this movie as a Chinese woman who was tamed by a Japanese officer before he married her, creating a sort of sort of image of Japan as a male dominating and civilizing figure, with China as a female wife and subjected figure. This is really a common kind of trope in propaganda films and propaganda plays. So among the songs that the government approved was Umi Yukaba, which was used as part of Japan's coercion of civilian behavior and civilian nationalism after the 226-1936 incident, in which Japanese soldiers attempted to take control of Japan in the name of the emperor and were eventually defeated, but for the most part let off free as demonstrating a sincere nationalism. And for that reason, it became increasingly clear that the government and public opinion was steering towards this extreme nationalism. Umi Yukaba was actually a famous song from the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan had defeated Russia in 1904 to 1905, surprising the world with its industrial and military power. So Umi Yukaba became, again, a very popular and important song used by the Japanese government to stir up nationalist feeling. However, songs like Umi Yukaba eventually became sort of too soft. In World War II, Japanese ultranationalism really began to demand the absolute sacrifice of civilians and soldiers in the name of the emperor. And these two songs, Doki no Sakura, or Cherry Blossom Classmates, and Senyu, are both songs in which the soldiers who go to war don't expect to survive. They expect to come home, in the case of Doki no Sakura, and be enshrined at the Yasukuni Shrine, which is pictured here, a shrine for memorializing Japan's war dead. And also today seen quite politically as a shrine where war criminals are enshrined. Senyu, or friend soldiers or comrade soldiers, is also a song in which the sacrifice of soldiers is the primary theme. So songs like Senyu, which were both nationalist but also glorified Japanese culture and talked about soldiers who wanted to come home to their families, had to be replaced by these songs of extreme dedication to the Empire of Japan and to the emperor himself, and not only willingness but expectation of death in battle. So popular music really did embody these extreme nationalist ideas. After the war, however, movies like Ringo no Uta, or the Apple Song, came out. This movie and the song itself are very jaunty and open, free. They express a Japan that appears to have lost the war, but is not really looking back at the ultranationalism of the war, has rejected much of the war period's social climate and nationalist climate, and is instead looking forward to rebuilding, to new prosperity, and to attempts to rebuild Japan. This movie is a sort of spring love story, and the song itself kind of embodies that whole thing, including an interesting sequence in which the parents sort of gently push together a woman and a soldier who's come home from the war in their apple orchard, and they do some flirting. It's quite cute, very happy, very nature-centered, very breezy kind of film. Gate of Flesh, on the other hand, looks at the end of the war and the occupation of Japan by the United States as a very dark period where the difficulty of rebuilding is sort of raw and on the surface. Gate of Flesh, or Nikutai no Mon, is a film about not just women, although primarily women, trying to survive in urban Tokyo at the end of the war, when the city is not even really begun rebuilding, and these women have to turn to what were considered risque pursuits like acting, dancing, and even prostitution in order to survive. This film has a very raw sense, but it also has a sense of new freedoms. These women live their own lives. They live their lives on their terms. They certainly work in what might have been before the war considered unsavory professions, but in many ways they are their own people, and they treat men in the same way that men treat them in this film. So in many ways, this film also shows a new kind of freedom um, and an attempt to escape from older nationalist values and even older Japanese values. The reality of trans-war Japan was probably somewhere in the middle of these two films. And what you see here is actually from the top left, images from Japan in the 1930s. Um, These are people waiting at a train station. And then on the top right, some children from the 1930s. Then in the bottom left, you see a couple right after the end of the war. And in the bottom right, you see a young couple walking the streets of Ginza in the shadow of some newly lit paper lanterns and a newly built large department store. And you can see that actually the cultural differences are not that large here, that in fact Japan, for all of the economic and physical destruction it encountered during the war, seems to have continued on a pattern of growth, of material growth, of industrialization, and growing prosperity even before the economic miracle of the 1960s. But one reality of the post-war period was the American occupation. And the American occupation brought with it this really ambivalent sense of the occupying force. That is, on the right, you can see the bombed out centers of Tokyo. This is the remains of Tokyo after the firebombing of April 1945. But on the left, you can see an American magazine, Jet, which is actually talking about romance between American soldiers, particularly in this case an African American soldier and a Japanese woman. And this is increasingly common in Japan. That is, Japanese women particularly, but also men would meet with foreigners, and the introduction of foreign people in Japan was common and growing. Americans brought prosperity, they brought jobs, they brought new ideas about freedom. In all kinds of different ways, Americans had a tremendous effect on Japan. The United States essentially wrote at least the first draft of Japan's post-war constitution, which was then passed through the Diet at the behest of Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur. And the Americans also brought with them candy, dolls, food. American military bases required workers. They also required musicians, and that's quite critical in understanding the development of music in Japan after the Second World War. One of the most important developments in music after the war was the rise of boogie woogie. And what you see here in this slide is up on the very top on the right, the Andrews Sisters. And the Andrews Sisters are very famous for boogie woogie songs like the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. These were popular American songs during the war, but they came to Japan with the occupation, and Japanese immediately after the end of the war grabbed onto boogie woogie as a sound of progress, a sound of freedom, a way to express their rejection of older ideas. And so I'm just going to play these some of these real quick so you can hear them, and then we'll move on. So you can hear the jazz influences there. There's a 4/4 rhythm. There's stride piano that provides a kind of musical rhythm, and then you've got the brass jazz band in the background, the big band, along with these three women who sing in unison. It's a very, very fast song, and it's certainly made for dancing, and that's what the video is about. This was an incredibly popular song and an incredibly popular style for the United States in the 1940s. And as I said, the occupation brought that style to Japan. So here's Kasagi Shizuko singing Hattori Ryuichi's composition called Tokyo Boogie Woogie. And Hattori was also a very famous composer from the 1930s. So this is a trans-war phenomenon. Popular music being brought to people by the same composers throughout the entire period before, during, and after the war. So there are a couple of things to look at when you see this song. First of all, you can hear the jazz influences and the boogie woogie American influences, right? You have the 4/4 time, you have the stride piano or the stride rhythm behind it. You have a big band with lots of brass, and in fact, you got a picture of Hattori himself directing the band. But you can also see that this song is for dancing. Now, the tradition in Japan in the 1930s and 1940s, and even the 1920s, had been for singers to sing standing at the microphone and not really to move around. But this song is made for moving, and it is intended to get people up and dancing. And in other videos from the time period of this film, it shows the audience and listeners dancing to it as well. So Boogie Woogie was huge, and it rocketed Kasagi Shizuko to the top of the music charts in Japan at the time. It, like the Andrews Sisters Boogie Woogie, brought a sense of excitement and happiness to what was altogether a dark time. Sorry about that. At the same time, young people were beginning to develop their own music, and they were listening to songs that in the early 1950s that we are familiar with in the United States, including songs by Elvis Presley. This is rockabilly from the Western Carnival, and it became incredibly popular among the youth in Japan, especially in the mid-1950s after the rise of television, when you could see these people and their personalities. So the big personality, the movement on the stage, the ability to play instruments, all of these things were visible on TV and became important in developing popular music. So Rock Around the Clock, 1955. Play a little bit more here. So you can hear that there was a rock sound in Japan already by the 1950s. Now, where did Japanese musicians learn to play boogie woogie and rockabilly? Well, they learned at American military bases, just like they learned to play jazz at American military bases. The military bases needed entertainment for their officers' clubs. There were even clubs in downtown, in the zones around Ginza, etc., where officers and enlisted men were billeted, and so these clubs required performers, and there weren't enough American performers to go around. So people would, that is, American club managers, etc., would go out looking for Japanese musicians who could play instruments, and especially if they could play jazz. And they'd bring them back, teach them the songs, and they would play for the night or several nights. This was good money, and so a lot of Japanese during the occupation period from 1945 to 1952 learned to play musical instruments and then got jobs on bases because they could get paid huge amounts more than they might get paid in regular Japanese establishments working for whatever business they might find. And in the process, they learned the new American music. They had a chance to listen to it. They had a chance to look at the album covers. They figured out how to dress like this, and they brought this music to Japan. And you can tell from all of it that it's been, to some degree, modified. Of course, they all sing in Japanese. Sometimes, like the songs you've heard, they sing actual songs that they've brought from Japan, from the United States. But in other cases, they actually created their own music that was based on the same principles, and so we have the birth of Japanese rockabilly. But the Western Carnival, which was a music festival of rockabilly in the 1950s, became so popular on TV that it encouraged young people to, for example, if they were living in or near Tokyo, to skip school and go to the rock festival. There were images on TV, and the promoters actually paid a few women to bring panties and streamers and stuff to the concert and throw them on stage at the young performers, and this shocked the older generation quite a bit. And so there was also a groundswell of popular protest by the parents of these young people against rockabilly. Eventually, the promoters of the Western Carnival then turned these rockabilly stars into what we would call light music stars, and they sang love songs, generally sweeter, a bit slower, and a lot less active, and probably a lot less danceable as well. The older generation also was looking for a music of its own that wasn't such a rejection of pre-war and wartime Japanese ideals. So this is Misora Hibari, Tokyo Kid. This is also post-war, immediate post-war. I think this film came out in 1952. So what you're seeing here is the woman as a girl who would become possibly Japan's most famous musical star ever. You're also watching what will be the birth of enka. So she's singing about how Tokyo is a great place, even though she doesn't have any money. She can sing for money. She can scurry around and get what she wants for food. If she's in danger, she can go underneath the streets in the basements or climb up to the top of the buildings if she wants to see the clear blue sky. So for her, Tokyo is paradise, no matter how poor she might be. And the conceit of the film is that this guy learned to play guitar, and he's not her father. They sort of met each other on the streets, and they wander around, and he plays guitar and she sings. But Misora Hibari would become the biggest star possibly in Japanese history. And you can already tell her voice in this film. She's about 9 years old. So what's going on here? Well, this song sounds very much like the Kaiyokyoku, the popular songs of the pre-war period, not the military songs that we looked at the beginning of this presentation, but the songs from that pre-war 1920s and early 1930s, songs by Koga Masao and Nakayama Shinpei with pentatonic yonanuki 5-note scales that were played often in a minor key using Western instrumentation. And this has many of the same themes. Life is difficult. There is duty that I have to follow, but I'm going to make the best of everything anyway. This kind of attitude, these are the things that the older generation was quite into and would become the building blocks of enka. So enka is really, in many ways, less a musical genre than it is a set of patterns. Now, what's the difference? Yes, a genre is a set of patterns. It's usually a set of musical patterns that are repeated throughout most of the songs that are considered to be within that genre. So every genre is somewhat fungible, right? Somewhat changeable in the way that it can be defined. Some songs fit according to some people and other songs fit according to other people. But enka is much more variable than that. And here's what's interesting about it. Enka sounded perpetually old. It erased the emotional gap between pre-war and post-war. It was sung by people who had roots in pre-war Kaiyokyoku and Ryukoka. And so it erased the musical gap between pre-war and post-war. It pretended to be traditional Japanese music, and it sounded much like older pop. Its main themes were love, loss, duty, tears, and silent suffering, and those reflected the experiences of its listeners. In other words, enka is really very much a trans-war kind of experience. And I won't play these songs here because there are a couple of things that I want to show you later. But enka has a very distinct sound. So here are some of the patterns, or as Christine Yana has called them in her book, the kata of enka. Right? In this case, we have amezakaba, right? This is a bar in the rain, and kanashi sake, sadness and sake. So these are the kinds of songs that you would hear, right? And this, by the way, is Misora Hibari. This is the adult version of the child that you just saw singing. Okay, so you can see a couple of the kata here already, and I'm about to introduce some of the rest of them to you. Enka singers have some very distinctive ways of dressing and styling their hair and showing themselves. And you can see two of the main kata or patterns that we have here. On the right side at the top, we can see that some enka singers dress in very formal wear. They dress in suits or tuxedos or formal dresses, usually quite showy. Or on the left, you can see the others. They dress in kimono and traditional or at least pseudo-traditional looks, right? You can see, by the way, that we have Kitajima Saburo in both cases right here, dressing both in a suit and in a kimono. And most performers actually in enka will do both, even in the same show. So these kata are patterns that you can identify enka songs with that are not entirely musical. And we'll start with mostly the words that you find in enka songs as some of the identifying kata. Now there's much more than this, but this is just a basic lesson. So the most common word in enka songs is tears, or namida. The second most common word in enka songs is kokoro, or heart. Not the kind of heart that beats your blood around in your body, but the kind of heart that feels love, right? Woman, or onna, is the third most popular, most common word in enka songs. Sake, alcohol, is the fourth most common word in enka songs. And love, koi, not I, Koi meaning um, a romantic, almost physical love, early love, not the kind that is long lasting necessarily, but the kind that starts out a very intense relationship. That that koi word is another common word in Enka songs. And Enka songs musically often partake of what we call the Yonanuki scale. Now, this was the basis of the Kaiyokyoku, or popular songs from the pre-war period as well. They're five-note scales that approximate the sound of traditional Japanese music by leaving out the fourth and the seventh notes, or Yonanuki. Okay, they come in both major and minor styles. And as you would guess, the major Yonanuki scale to American ears often sounds a bit brighter than the minor Yonanuki scale, which sounds more dark and dusky, I guess. But that's not really the way Japanese often characterize them. In fact, they're often characterized as an urban scale and a rural scale, or as a major scale and a minyo or folk scale. So the minor scale has a country feel. It has a feel of villages and agriculture, whereas the major scale is considered to be kind of an urban sound. So that's the way that they're often characterized in Japanese. Enka instruments usually include one or two Japanese instruments, but most of the time, if there's a Japanese instrument, it's going to be a shamisen. Otherwise, Enka includes guitar, accordion, trumpet, saxophone, piano, and violin. So it is very heavy on Western instruments, but using that five-note Yonanuki scale, it often sounds very, very, for lack of a better word, pardon the expression, but very oriental in a quoted way. So what I want to do is play a couple songs and have you tell me if you think it's Enka or it's not Enka. So here's the first song. Well, I'll play those in class. In many ways, Korea after the Second World War was also in a very interesting situation in terms of musical development. And like Japan, that musical development had to do with politics and social developments as well. So you can see here that South Korea was easily as badly damaged as Japan was at the end of the Second World War. And Korea didn't get the kind of occupational assistance that the United States received. It also had a lot more to rebuild because it had a society to rebuild as well, and a government to rebuild, as well as its cities, roadways, etc. This is just a few images of immediate post-war poverty and destruction in the Korean peninsula. And Korea, by the way, remained unified for a short time after World War II. And as Dr. J mentioned, the first, really the second governor of Korea, the first president who really ruled and had a major impact on Korean policy and development was Park Chung-hee, who was dictator really from 1961 to 1987. And as Dr. J mentioned, he was also a collaborator or a member of the Japanese army during World War II, signed his name in blood to his enlistment contract, and he ran Korea, South Korea, in many ways very much like the Japanese had organized it as well. He was clearly a military dictator and had very specific ideas. The Korean music industry also had to start fresh. Trot, like Enka, was not traditional, but a post-war creation. It was a kind of polyglot new music. I'll play some for you in just a second. Both enka and trot came from Kayokyoku, but I want to complexify this a little bit because Kayokyoku had borrowed from Korean and Western music in the pre-war period. So it's not really clear. We cannot say that directly. We can say that trot came from enka. Um, well, trot came from Kayokyoku, and enka also came from Kayokyoku. But as I said, Kayokyoku has a huge number of different influences, and music learned on the Korean peninsula, both by Koga Masao and Nakayama Shinpei and other composers, borrowed from Western and Korean traditions as well. Trot was, in Park Chung-hee's mind, politically acceptable. It was nostalgic for a kind of Korean culture that was supposedly free of Japanese influences, and so Park Chung-hee was willing to accept trot. He wasn't really interested in other musics. He wanted something that would move Korean nationalist ideologies forward in order to create unity and a society that would work together. So among these is this tune. Now, if you've looked at this before we play any further, there's a piano, an organ, a violin, a trumpet, and an oboe. This is almost exactly the same or instrumentation as enka. And what you're hearing there that sounds probably Korean to you is a Yonanuki scale. It's a Western scale designed to sound like an Eastern musical experience. So if you look at the presentation in its non-video form that I will post along with this video, you'll also be able to click on these links for arirang, which is a performance of what is considered to be a traditional Korean song, and then a Japanese performance of arirang, enka style. And you'll find that in many ways they're very similar to each other, and in fact the Japanese admired and borrowed Korean musical styles. Arirang continues to be sung in Japan today. It's quite popular. And then also for comparison purposes, you can listen to some Kayokyoku from Koga Masao by clicking on this link. But let's move on a little bit. So in 1965, Japan and South Korea signed the Treaty on Basic Relations. And again, as Dr. J said, the Japanese have in fact paid reparations, and the Republic of Korea and Japan, by this treaty, reestablished relations, and Japan agreed to pay $300 million in grants, $200 million in loans, and $500 million in credits to South Korea. This agreement was made between Sato Eisaku in Japan, the Prime Minister, and President Park Chung-hee of South Korea. Japan made it clear, and Korea agreed in this agreement, to consider this to be reparations for the war, and that this normalized relations. And Japan and Korea both agreed to no future claims. Now, there's a link here that you can use, but Park Chung-hee did use this money, but he didn't choose to pay it out to individual Koreans or even families or groups who had suffered during the war. Instead, he chose to invest it in Korean business, particularly in Korean chaebol, which were large corporate combines. So Pak Chung-hee then used his power, this investment from Japanese reparations, loans, and credits, and built Korea on a wartime Japanese model of dictatorship. That is to say, he ruled and his organizational system, including the organizational systems of the companies that are now called chaebol, that he invested this money in, were built on Japanese pre-war models. Here's some of the chaebol, and chaebol are organized in almost the same way exactly as Japanese pre-war zaibatsu, or large cultural family-owned combines, were in the pre-war period. Those zaibatsu didn't exist in Korea because, remember, Korea was a colony of Japan, and it was organized for Japanese colonial use. So zaibatsu that would, chaebol that might compete with zaibatsu were not allowed. So these are post-war creations based on the Japanese corporate organizational model from the pre-war period. The goal was to make Korea rich by manufacturing. Pak also established a surveillance state, and what you see here is a police officer actually checking the length of a man's hair. Pak Chung-hee's state was in every way intrusive into the lives of its citizens, requiring Koreans to work very hard for quite low pay and to uphold certain social and behavioral patterns. Many of these were just sort of preferences of Pak. Pak Chung-hee was eventually assassinated by his own security chief, and in 1979, Chun Do-hwan became the leader of South Korea, also a dictator, and continued to operate the state in many ways in the same way that Pak Chung-hee had done. In 1980, Koreans began demonstrating for more civil rights and freedoms against the dictatorship of Chun Do-hwan, and looking for more rights, better wages, and more opportunities to live their lives according to the ways that they wanted to. What you see here is primarily Korean students demonstrating and being opposed by the Korean military, and you can see some similarities with some of our activities today in the United States. In 1987, these risings finally came to a peak in a struggle for democracy, which eventually forced the South Korean government to accept a democratic election system, and that system of elections is the system that Korea operates under today. So during the period that we've been talking about, you also have the development of Korean rock and roll, and this is Shin Jung-hyun, who was Korea's first rocker, and one of possibly the most skilled guitarists in rock history globally. He was really an amazing guitar player, but his music was not appreciated by Pak Chung-hee. It was considered to be subversive. It encouraged youth, Pak thought, to grow their hair long, to not want to go to work, to be in many ways sort of like Americans, right? Free thinking, not interested in following tradition, all of the things that Pak was trying to instill in Koreans. So Shin Jung-hyun's rock was banned until 1987. Shin was orphaned during the war, the Korean War, so 1950 to 1952. And he started to play guitar in his teens, right? He listened to the Far East Network, which was broadcast in the clear in both Korea and Japan at this time. So he could hear American rock and roll on the American Far East Network radio. That is a military broadcast system. And it's the same system, by the way, that J-Wave borrowed formats from in the 1980s in Japan. Anyway, Shin, in 1957, like the Kim sisters and other Korean acts, began to appear on U.S. bases. Now, if this sounds familiar, if it sounds like the Japanese in the occupation period, well, you're right. American military bases, using local entertainers to play American-style rock and roll and their own rock and roll was one of the most common ways for uh, popular music, American style, to spread throughout the Pacific region. American soldiers really loved his guitar solos, and if you listen to them, I think you'll love them too. They're tremendous. And he became, in the American bass nomenclature, Jackie Shin, very, very successful. But his music was banned in Korea, couldn't be sold. He wasn't allowed to perform, so he had to sort of work underground until